Alright, so in this video I'm going to do a code walkthrough of the tutorial I have posted on my website for the basic Python webhook tutorial for Dialogflow. And the first thing that I want to mention is that you should already have some basic understanding of Python, the programming language, to be able to follow along with this video. And you should have some understanding of how the Flask web framework works, and in case you don't, you can actually go to the Flask documentation page, and I would say that all you really need to do is go through the quick start page over here, and that should be sufficient as a background to follow what I'm going to talk about in this particular video. Alright, so now the first thing I want you to notice is that I want to run this, and when you run it, you can see that the Replit site, it actually does the work of installing different things. And also I want you to notice the URL that it generated. So if I were to go to this URL in an individual tab, it will just take a second, and you can see that it's coming back with the hello world. Now what is happening when this particular URL is accessed is that it is going to go and execute this portion of code, because that's the route which is handling the home page or the slash followed by nothing. Now if you don't understand that, that's fine. You can, once you go through the quick start, I think that it will be quite clear what is going on. Now the stuff that we are actually interested in is this app.route/webhook, and also notice that the methods here it's just a post method, which means a post request is sent to this URL. That is, when a post request is sent to this URL, it is going to execute all the code inside this method. That's exactly how Flask works. And here you notice that this is the URL. If you don't have anything after the slash, it's just the home URL, and it's going to return this hello world, and that's because this code is running. It's just returning hello world. On the other hand, if you were to access this URL with a post method, it's going to execute all this code. Now let's go to Dialogflow, and this is the fulfillment URL that I'm using, and notice that this is the URL which we have, which is this https followed by multiple intents.arvindmohanur.repl.co, and then notice that there is a slash webhook, which means when this URL is called, it is actually going to execute this piece of code, because Dialogflow actually does a post request with a bunch of data, and that data is actually getting to this URL, and subsequently it is getting into this method. Now you can go and take a look at the format of the data which is sent in the Dialogflow documentation, but the basic idea is that this line, once it gets the request, so let's just imagine that we are asking it to add, let's say 8 and 20, something like that, and it's just going to take a few seconds, and you can see that it comes back with the response you expected. The sum of the two numbers is 28. Now if I were to go into this diagnostic info, what you can see is that this is the this is the fulfillment request which was actually sent across to Dialogflow. Okay, so you have this JSON object, and you can see that it has all these fields inside. The response ID is there, and then there's this object called query result, which contains some query text, and notice that the action is the add.numbers. That's because the add.numbers intent is the one which is triggered when we have this phrase. We already know that. And then also notice that it has these parameters where number has the value 8, number 1 has the value 20, and this is because Dialogflow is able to look at this request, and it's able to determine two things. The first thing is that it's got this word add, which means that it's going to be mapped to the add intent and not to the multiply intent. And the second thing it is able to infer is the values of the parameters inside of that phrase. By the way, this is exactly what makes Dialogflow so powerful, because it's able to actually do this. Now It has a bunch of other stuff over here. We are not going to be concerned about it, at least not for this particular video. But this is the fulfillment request which is sent to my webhook code over here. And now you can see that the rest of the code starts to make sense. So the first step is we have this request object which just takes the JSON coming from the request. And the next thing we do is you can see that inside the query result we store request.get query result. So if I were to go back here, this is going to store everything inside this object. The query result will contain everything inside that. And then the next thing is we check to see what is inside the action field of the query request, query result. Is it add.numbers? And that's exactly the case here. The action field is add.numbers. And if it is, we are going to go into this if block, and notice that this again is trying to do another get where it does query result.get parameters.get number, which is you go from query result to parameters to number and you're going to get the value 8. Query result.parameters.number1 will give you the value 20. Right? Now with all this information you are able to compute the sum of the two numbers, and you can see that what I'm doing is you have the sum equals str of num1 plus num2 because we send back a string in the response, and then that is I add these numbers and then get the string representation of the sum. So then you assign fulfillment text to this phrase which we just saw. The sum of the two numbers is blah, and then it's going to come to this point in this method and it's going to return this object. And here is what I would call as like the minimum blob of data you need to send back from your webhook so that Dialogflow is able to read that information. So it has to return a JSON object. The JSON object should contain the fulfillment text is mandatory. I imagine that the display text is also mandatory, but I think that kind of depends on the recipient. I think that in some cases depends on the whether you're going to send it back to a Google Assistant app or something. You may be able to omit this, and then I think the source is not mandatory, but I have put it here anyway. So the point I'm making is that this is sort of like the minimum viable JSON object which has to be sent back from your webhook code so that you're actually able to see some result in the simulator over here. Now you do the exact same thing. Now you say multiply 8 and 20, and you can see that now it says the product of the two numbers is 160. Let's quickly take a look, and you can see that everything is similar. Query text is just the whole phrase, but notice that the action is now multiply.numbers because it got mapped to another intent, the other intent multiply.numbers. And the parameters, of course, it extracted the old ones. Number is 8, number 1 is 20. And in this case, the code will go into this other block, which is, if the query result.get action equals multiply.numbers, it's going to get num1 and num2. And instead of computing the sum, here we are computing the product. And then you do the same thing with the fulfillment text, and then you return that fulfillment text back to the Dialogflow agent. Also, I want you to notice, and this is a very nice thing about Replit site, notice that as soon as it got a request, it also has this information it's showing on the side where it's indicating that it actually got this post method, like it just got a post request sent to the /webhook method, and it also says that it sent back a proper response because that's what this 200 actually indicates. So this is how the code that I showed in the tutorial, this is how it actually works.